and welcome to Dining with Death. This episode is on our playlist, Dining with the Deceased, where we visit sites that are supposedly haunted. Today I'm coming to you from the former site of Sunland Children's Hospital near Orlando, Florida. We're going to talk a little bit about the area, we're going to talk a little bit about the facility, and of course we're going to take a tour of the area that includes the food nearby. I'm Stacy Lee. Let's begin. West of downtown Orlando, about 8 miles outside of town, lies the site of what was once Sunland Mental Hospital. In the 1950s, the state of Florida opened a chain of these hospitals to isolate and care for patients with tuberculosis. We think of tuberculosis as a disease of the 1800s, and we often forget there was not any type of cure for this disease until 1949. Tuberculosis killed millions for centuries and was a leading cause of death for a very long time. Well into the 1950s, people were still suffering and dying from this disease because the treatment, the newly made streptomycin antibiotic, wasn't in mass production or available to people at the time. The tuberculosis hospitals, not just in Florida, but all over the country, were constructed the same way. They were always rectangular, thin buildings with very long hallways and patient rooms on each side of those hallways. Back then, it was believed that fresh air and sunshine were paramount to the treatment of tuberculosis, and this hospital design allowed for each patient room to have a large window for sunshine and air. By the 1960s, doctors and scientists had figured out how to mass produce the drugs needed to treat tuberculosis, and the disease slowly began to disappear. That meant that many of these huge old hospitals were no longer necessary. Most of them were owned by the governing state bodies, and these states now had to decide what they were going to do with these giant buildings. Some became schools, like the one we visited in Gooding, Idaho back in May of 2021. That episode is on this playlist. That place was incredible and very creepy. But many of the hospitals that didn't become schools or boarding houses went from treating tuberculosis patients to treating people with mental disease and disability. And sadly, many of these hospitals were grossly underfunded and poorly managed, which led to a lot of suffering. If you've seen the documentary Cropsey, you know about the horrors of these hospitals. If you haven't seen Cropsey and you like dark things like I do, you're definitely going to want to see that. It's one of my favorite documentaries. In it is included a segment featuring a young Geraldo Rivera who visits Willowbrook State School, and his coverage of what was happening there shocked the country. Sometimes when I watch Cropsey, I have to skip over those scenes because they just send me into a tailspin for days. You just cannot even imagine the horror that was going on in these hospitals. But this piece of news footage that Geraldo Rivera produced shone a light on how terrible the system was for the mentally ill and disabled, and it did bring much needed change. I bring up that documentary because what happened there is very similar to what happened here at Sunland Mental Hospital. We don't have a lot of photos of the conditions or the patients at Sunland. I found a few, not many, because they didn't have a tenacious journalist exposing the horrific treatment and conditions inside, with a camera crew, like what happened at Willowbrook, but we do know about it from personal accounts. The Sunland hospitals were located throughout Florida, but the Orlando facility that stood right here in this huge vacant grassy area was by far the most notorious. It was known for its horrific conditions and for the maltreatment of patients. And I'm not just talking about, like a dirty hospital. I'm talking about treatment that escalated to blatant torture and abuse. I won't go into detail. This platform won't allow it. And even if it did, it's something I have a very difficult time talking about. Sometimes I wish I didn't know about these things, I like these dark subjects, but certain things just kind of cross the line for me. Suffice it to say, it was unimaginable, and thousands of people in need of treatment not only did not get that treatment, but they were abused inside this system. By the mid-1970s, the Orlando facility that stood here was experiencing terrible management problems. The facility was severely underfunded, and of course that meant the people who worked there were severely underpaid. No one wanted to work there. It was a terrible job in horrific conditions for little money. Rumors began to spread about what was happening inside that facility, and by the late 1970s, the facility was put on notice to clean things up or face closure. An investigator from the Orlando Sentinel went undercover, and what he found was unbelievable. Over 400 patients were on gastric feeding tubes being fed nothing but a cereal-like gruel 3 times a day. The surgical areas were not safe or sterile, and I won't even go into the conditions the children were forced to endure. The governing state body, I'm not going to mention the title of that organization because it's a word we don't use anymore, they made promises for reform, but change never took place. The hospital got some really bad press when a pest control company was sent out to try and deal with the roach control issue. The roaches had basically taken over the building. They were absolutely everywhere, even in the fire alarm boxes. There were so many of them that they would crowd into these fire alarm box covers and would actually press the button down hard enough to set off the alarm. Then the alarms would automatically close the fire doors, locking the patients and staff inside. I'm not sure what kind of fire doors trap people. I'm assuming it's to keep the fire from spreading. But yes, the conditions were just hellish. In 1978, a class action lawsuit was filed by a group called Something We Don't Say Anymore, on behalf of the patients inside Sunland Hospital. And this lawsuit forced the state of Florida to close all of its Sunland facilities in 1983. Now, as you can see here, this is not prime real estate. We came down a very remote and tiny side street to get here. It didn't even feel like a city road. There's no curb and gutter or lane division. It's more like a paved path than it is a road. There is nothing back here. It sits in a low area of land, and I'm sure it's prone to flooding. This real estate is not worth anything, even in Orlando, Florida. So the state could not sell it, or perhaps they just couldn't find anybody to pay what they wanted for it. The giant buildings, the old hospital, sat rotting and decaying for over a decade, and as they did, rumors began to spread that they were haunted. Soon, the buildings were a draw for ghost hunters and paranormal investigators. Visitors and explorers report hearing screams and crying. They claimed to hear children wailing, crying coming from the basement. Many people reported seeing shadows darting from patient room to patient room and a feeling of being watched at all times. There are reports of an ominous presence in the basement that throws things and pushes people. Visitors swear they saw children staring at them from the hallways that then vanished before their eyes. In 1997, there was a group of friends in the building exploring the old hospital, walking around, messing around, kind of scaring each other and telling ghost stories. There was no electricity, obviously, so that meant not a lot of light. And as one of the men walked to the end of the hallway, he took one step too many. 23-year-old Keith Murdoch plunged 3 stories down the elevator shaft, crashing at the bottom. He had severe injuries and was in a coma for 2 weeks. This led the Pine Hills community locals to petition the state to demolish the building once and for all, and in 1999, that's exactly what they did. Demolition crews were brought in and the building was torn to the ground. All that is left is this large empty field, and I have to tell you, it's creepy as hell. It looks like a grassy area, right? Big nice trees around it. It doesn't feel that way at all. I'm a very skeptical person, but I'm here to say this place feels dark and very heavy. It feels sad. If I'm being honest, I was in a dark mood after we left here. Now, I'm sure that had a lot to do with the research I had done before arriving. I knew what went on here, and I was envisioning it for the duration of our visit. I was imagining the old building standing here in this depressing place, and I imagined the smell. I'm a person with a very strong sense of smell, and I am very bothered by certain smells, and that's kind of all I could think about. Surrounding the big grassy area are these very sad little administration buildings. My hat is off to the people who work here. I couldn't come here every day. You can tell they've put new roofs on them and they've tried to maintain them, but they're just very depressing. One of these offices has something to do with probation and parole, and the other had a sign that said Florida Department of Health. There are a lot of reports from people who work in these administration buildings of hauntings. They claim to not only hear, but to see children in the halls and around the grounds of the buildings. The address is actually All Children's Way, which, knowing the history just kind of sends a chill down your spine. The whole area is on a loop, and as you enter that loop, there is this little covered directory telling visitors which building is where. I don't think they get a lot of visitors here. We were here for over an hour and no one entered or exited the entire time. As you can see, the view from this little covered information stand is very bleak. The drizzle turned into a pretty steady rain, and that just added to the very depressing vibe of this area. I thought about all of the families who had been in and out on these streets, none of them happy to be here. They probably came here to visit only when they had to, and I'm sure it was never pleasant. It feels like they left all of their sadness here. It really does. If this place were not creepy enough, there are a couple of little old houses on the site, and yes, they do look like there are people in them. Maybe not legally, but someone is using them. One of them looks like it's being used in some official capacity, and then there is this area that looks like it might have been housing at one point, maybe dorms for staff. There's a little picnic area with covered seats that's, well, yeah. I think these little sheds creeped me out the most. You know, there's probably nothing in them but tools, but probably. There's just something especially creepy about a little old shed in the backwoods, swampy area of a Florida mental hospital that, yeah, you won't see families having their Christmas card photos taken here. That's what I can be sure of. But of all the sad little structures in this depressing place, the most depressing feature by a long shot is the playground, if you can really call it that. It's just a bare minimum factory-produced setup plopped in the middle of this field that was once the foundation for a house of horrors, a hospital of horrors. There is a very sad little gazebo that isn't even big enough for a table and a couple of park benches. This area is a popular place for people doing nefarious things at night, and it is very much still a draw for ghost hunters. People who come here at night report ghostly apparitions of children sitting on top of the playground turret. They report that the swings move violently on their own as if someone is yanking on the chains, and again, there are many reports of children crying. Many of the children who died at Sunland were buried here at the Greenwood Cemetery in a designated area called Babyland. I am not into this at all. The poor little things don't even have names on their headstones. It's just awful. This sad little playground, sitting here lifeless, run down, and unused, is really a visual symbol of the way this whole place feels. These are sad and shameful chapters in our history. Even for those of us who like to talk about dark and morbid things, this kind of stuff is too dark and morbid. I feel strongly that it's important to talk about these events, these places, and the people who have been mostly forgotten. It matters to me because if we don't remember these awful things, we do a disservice to the people who lived through them. And on top of that, we forget just how easily some of us become monsters. We forget just how quick some people are to throw other human beings away. We have to remember these dark chapters in history, so we remember never to forget them. We remember never to repeat them. Whew. Well, after that, we are definitely in need of a little boost, right? And you know me, when I need to feel better, I'm going to get something delicious to eat. We always visit a restaurant in our haunted location on this playlist because this is Dining with Death, and today we found a really fun spot that was just what we needed to lift our spirits, and maybe lift the spirits of the ones who followed us here. This is Hook and Reel Cajun Seafood Bar. I'm not a huge fan of chain restaurants, and I usually try to feature a local mom and pop when I can, but this place has really good reviews, and it was very close to our haunted location, so we decided to eat here. The place is cozy and has lots of kitschy nautical decor to go with the seafood theme. There's a little stage for live music that's next to the bar area, and I'm sure this place gets busy in the evenings. We're in the South, so you know we had to start with some sweet tea. We ordered the seafood boil bags. These kinds of restaurants are very popular in Vegas. We have things like Hot and Juicy down there. You choose your seasoning and the level of spiciness you want, and then your food is cooked and tossed into the bag with whatever you've chosen to flavor it. They toss it around in the seasoned butter, and it coats the food so nicely. For me, it's always all about the crab. I'm a Cancer zodiac, so my husband loves to call me a cannibal because I'm eating crab whenever I can get my hands on it. Honestly, I could eat it every day. Jason got his spicy, of course, and he's got lots of andouille sausage in his. These almost always come with corn and potatoes, but the star of the show is the seafood. The shrimp is always really tender. You can also get clams and mussels, scallops, and even lobster tails if you want. We really liked this place. The service was great and the food was delicious, and well, we just needed a nice meal after this sad story. Food is the one thing that makes us all happy. We all love food. It brings us together. It's the great commonality, and that's why I incorporate it here. We talk about a lot of dark things here in the true crime community because we find them interesting, but I like to put out the reminder that we also have a lot in common, more than we remember at times. Life is short, my friends. Enjoy every minute. You never know when it will be over, but if you believe the stories you hear on this playlist, you can apparently come back and visit anytime. Thank you for joining me today on Dining with Death, Dining with the Deceased. Please like and subscribe if you haven't yet. I sure appreciate you watching. Stay safe and be kind to each other, and I'll see you next time on Dining with Death.